Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I'm your host, Marianne Petrie. If you are struggling in a high conflict relationship, divorce, custody battle, or co-parenting situation that requires individualized attention, let Chris and Lisa at Been There Got Out hold your hand along the way while providing expert strategic guidance based on one's year's experience and success as a pro se, coupled with the other's high conflict divorce coach certification. I will have beentheregotout.com in the podcast notes. And right now I welcome back Michael Sayin. He's back on my show. The last time he was on, we talked about Woe to the Wedding Band. I think that's appropriate for Halloween, but we're going to talk about other things. That was season 2, episode 77. So he's back on the show today, and we have a lot to talk about as far as going through family court and how people treat us as we go through family court. And I will throw in some other things along the way. So I totally welcome you, Michael. How's it going?
Hey, it's funny. We were just talking about the old phrase, how's it going? I was sharing with Marianne that I was in the Gulf War. I was a Marine in the Gulf War and the frontline troops. And the term how is it going, or how are you doing meant a lot different than in our social kind of realm of, hey, how you doing? And then expecting a fine, great, even sometimes a praise the Lord. But when you're in the middle of combat and you say how it's going, what you mean is, do you have any holes in you? Are your magazines fine? Did you get any sleep this week? Do you need any food? And so that had a whole different context. So when people, but we know it was the sad thing is that people who do not go through divorce don't really understand what you're going through. And not only that, but they get a little perturbed if that you come out in a negative light. If you come out somehow that you're complaining or whining, because I think in general, people believe that the legal system is still fair. But us in family law realize that people are very corruptible, especially when there's a lot of money and children involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it all revolves around money. Some people maybe listening to this podcast understand that, but people that don't know and are just listening in, they don't realize it's $1 billion business a year.
That's right. Billions. And a lot of political push, a lot of pull, legislators, legislation, and the devil, is after people, is after your family, so, if we have to be honest, the government wants your family broken up and dissolved, because people don't know this, that did you notice, Marianne, that originally no-fault divorce was designed under Marxism in 1917 in Russia, under Karl Marx, and it was designed to destroy the family unit, because what they thought, the government realized that if the family is dissolved, the women can enter into the workforce, and the government has more control over the family unit. So they actually were the ones who initiated unilateral no-fault divorce. And even they, shortly after 1917, a short period of time, the divorce ratio to marriage ratio was 5-1. So people were divorcing at 5 times the number of marriages. They realized they started having a problem. And so, but still today, the government really does not want the woman to stay at home and to raise the kids, right? The woman wants small families, small homes. It doesn't really care if it breaks up the family, because again, that's going to be more taxes. That's more work, more taxes, more money for the government, more power, more control, and more socialism, right? It pushes the socialist factors of the government's the big daddy of the children. The government takes the place as a protector and provider of the man for the woman, and she'll leave the suppression of dogmatism of religion, or just the social pressures of that a woman should be submissive to her husband. So the whole thing about destruction of families, don't think that the government is doing everything they can to save the families. They actually traditionally, especially under socialism, Marxism and communism, they always wanted the woman to enter into the workforce. So single mothers actually make a stronger government as far as financial, because they add more to the financial taxes, more to the financial pot. But what they're doing is they're trading the social destruction, because once you destroy the family, you destroy the town, you destroy the state, you could destroy the nation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a consequence of having women leave their husbands and entering into the workforce.
Mm-hmm. And they try to make it sound appealable to the woman to leave and go into the workforce. They try to make it
Exactly.
sound, yeah.
They still do not like. There's really no profit for the government when women want to stay at home and raise their kids. So it's just it's a sad part of. It's very important for real people to realize that the government. A lot of times, people think, well, there's a lot of programs out there that want to help keep the family together, but in actuality, they know that socially, as far as morality, and the longevity of the nation is tied up in the strong families. But they also realize that broken families produce more income, and it's legislators trade off back and forth. They sometimes are willing to take the immediate gratification of control and money over the long-term success of the nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they really don't care about the families. In fact, they're now interfering with the schools and parents, and that's
That's
recently
right.
come up.
That's right.
And
So what happens is a lot of people, and Marion, this is like really important for people to understand. So I kind of explained this on the last show, but the parents portray. The parents portray is a very important doctrine that was started in England in 1608. I mentioned this before. The reason why it's important is because the only thing that battles, the only thing that can go against your constitutional unalienable rights to your family, to your children, to your wife, even to your husband, the only thing that can go against that unalienable fundamental liberty right is the government using the parents portray doctrine, saying that the nation is the true parent, or the nation is the parent of the child. However, this was really twisted, the original intent of this. Now, this is so this is very important. I think it was in 1967 or 68. There was a famous United States Supreme Court case called Henry Galt. It was about a teenage boy. This is amazing. So what happened was, a teenage boy, you got to hear this. This is a really famous case. The teenage boy calls the next door neighbor, right, and makes a prank phone call. This is a next door neighbor. Now, what happened was, since he was underage, this is based on juvenile court, right? So juvenile court started in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was based on parents portray doctrine. They based the whole entire thing on a doctrine. They didn't give children due process rights. Children were not seen as having constitutional protections. And those courts, the juvenile courts that the United States started, was very laxed.
mm-hmm.
However, what they did was, under the parents portray doctrine, they were taking children away from parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the parents wouldn't have the due process rights. The parents didn't have the right to a jury, right? The parents didn't have the right to due process for their children. This was based on socialism, because in 1875, as I mentioned earlier, the entire case of socialism, meaning that like we're a constitutional republic, but socialism was based on really a government-controlled, strong government-funded programs. Right, that was the intent of socialism. You have more of maybe egalitarian or equality mixed in there, but there really was based on the government gains more control, but the government promises to be the provider and protector of the people of the nation. So under socialism, really what happened is, under the 14th Amendment, around, I think it was 1886, but around 1875, the government used the parents portray doctrine to say that the nation is the parent of the children. and they started to implement stronger protections for children. Now, under stronger protections for children doesn't mean stronger protections for the children to remain in their family. What it meant was it made the government being able to take children out of the home without finding abuse or neglect as a criminal matter. So what would happen was parents in the 1875s to the early 1900s under juvenile courts, the juvenile systems, which are extremely unconstitutional, but it was based on that, we don't need, the government wanted the ability to be able to take children out of the home without pressing criminal matters against the parents. So that was the start of the juvenile courts under the parents par tre doctrine, that the nation is the parent of the children, so therefore they have supremacy over the children, therefore they have supremacy over the parental rights or the parents' constitutional rights. So under the case of R.E. Galt, the boy made a prank call. Normally, if that boy was an adult, they would have probably just got a 6-month sentence, probably something very, very light. But however, because he was a minor, the government swept in, took him away from his parents, and I think they separated him from his parents for 6 years. And the parents, and this went to the United States Supreme Court. Now, this is the reason why this is important, because the United States Supreme Court, on their dissent, what they said was, they said this parents par tre doctrine is historically dubious. That was the exact quote that they used. It was historically dubious. This was the first time that United States Supreme Court justice actually admitted that parents par tre doctrine has no rule of law. There is no rule of law. It's based on common law, and that means it's based on prior court cases. It wasn't based on any kind of law, right? There was no federal law. There was, and it wasn't law in England through the common law courts. But basically, what happened was in 1608. We have infant children, and we have, like I said, adults who couldn't take care of themselves, or infants, and they call them imbeciles. But people who couldn't take care of themselves, they became wards of the state, not by force, but people, like, they just had no one to take care of them. So the state says, well, if nobody's going to be a parent to these abandoned babies, infants that were left at the church door, and abandoned by families, and if nobody's going to, because they didn't have, abortion at the time, or sorry, that much abortion probably. I think they were taking like cyanide, or they're drinking some pretty bad stuff to kill the baby. But they would also, same thing with the adults who are retarded, or who are handicapped. They would they would take care of those people, and they said, well, the nation is the parent of the children. Now, the problem was that it originally started as a very good thing in 1608. That was under the courts of equity. Courts of equity only handled very few matters. They were handled by the court. They were handled by the Catholic Church, actually. So they're under the courts of chancery. The bishop or a lay leader in the church would use canon law and civil law, and they would decide morality, right? These courts were based on moral principles, but they were based on the moral principles of the Bible, or biblical principles, or canon law. And then what happened was these courts of equity didn't handle divorce, right? They didn't handle juvenile situations originally. It was originally to handle a few cases that common law courts could not handle, because the remedy, right, it needed more flexible remedy. Common law courts could not provide flexible remedy. I know I'm kind of going all over the place, but it's important to realize that this parent par tre doctrine in the United States, when it went to the Supreme Court justice said that, hey, this is a dubious thing. This is historically dubious. This has no really legal precedence. It was basically just the King of England using his supremacy to rule over, or to gain control over, the rule of law, right? And that was the original intent in England. That's how traditionally how the United States has used it. Now, other doctrines have come from that other doctrines have come from that parents par tre doctrine, such as the best interests of the child standards. People don't understand that around 1875, it's kind of hard to find historically where exactly it was first used, but and this was based a lot on the 14th Amendment, when that kind of came into practice, and the constitutional rights of citizens, right, extended more it kind of freed women and children from property rights, right? They were no longer considered under property law rights. So it kind of freed them up because they're like, hey, we're citizens. It freed the blacks up to be able to be considered people, and because they were formerly considered under property rights as well as of the man. So it kind of started to loosen up that coverture laws. It loosened up the property laws, started to give him more rights to women and children.
Mm-hmm.
So in around 1875, we have a case where a father, at this time, people don't understand, but a lot of children were working. They're entering into the workforce a little bit, actually even a little earlier. Matter of fact, in Massachusetts in the 1600s, if you didn't train your child in education in something that would profit him later on, the government, this is in Massachusetts in 1600s, they would go in and they would take the children away from parents, not because of abuse and neglect, but just because they weren't teaching their children a productive skill to enter into the workforce. And then they would have other families be guardian over these children, but these guardians over the children weren't going to public school, they weren't getting homeschooled, they were entering into the workforce at, like, I think even as young as 7, 8, 9 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we had our children labor laws. This is all,
Mm-hmm.
but the government was taking children away from parents in the United States in the 1600s in Massachusetts, because based on labor laws, right? They wanted the children to be able to be educated in a way, either through school or be educated in a trade that was able to be productive, and that would be able to produce not only income for the state, but also provide them with longevity, for the children, longevity as they eventually became adults and married. Now, so this whole parents part trade doctrine, like I said, it was used in 1875. I'm going to go back a little bit, when a father handed his two boys out to a guardian. He just left them basically abandoned. He gave this to this guardian to be able to watch. There was a family. This guardian eventually died, so he had an inheritance. So the inheritance, he actually, while the children were still young, the two boys were still young, he gave that inheritance to the two boys. Well, what happens is the father, right? He popped up on the scene, and he said, "Well, wait a minute, children are still under property rights, right? Because they didn't really have the 14th Amendment at that time. So what happens? Children are under property rights. So he goes, well, since the children are my property, everything they own is my property. Therefore, I want all the inheritance." And this actually went in front of a judge, and the judge said, even though the children are property of you, and under your parental rights, right, as a father, that he was able to gain the inheritance of the children, the judge said, I'm going to go on a limb here, and he says, it's not in the best interest of these children for you to get their inheritance. So he actually ruled in favor of the children. So that's one of the first cases. Now, so it's always been, the parents part trade doctrine has always been the foundation of government having that ability to be able to, with abuse and neglect, to go ahead and to violate your constitutional rights. And it's important to realize that your constitutional rights to raise your child is a fundamental liberty right, right? Your liberty cannot be taken away from you unless you're found guilty for a crime, right? That's why throwing you into jail, it's taking away your liberty. Restraining orders, taking away Second Amendment right. Those are liberty. So you really are not supposed to be able to have a liberty taken away from you unless you have broken a law, right? A crime, and or the government needs to balance socially two people's unalienable rights. Like the old saying is that, hey, it might be my unalienable right of freedom of speech to yell fire. However, if I go into a crowded movie theater and I yell fire and I practice my inalienable right, it violates other people's inalienable rights because they're going to run out and a lot of people might die. So the thought was, and you'll hear this case a lot in law, they say that, when one person's inalienable rights violates another person's inalienable right, the government has to come in and narrowly tailor that inalienable right so that it would be productive for society, right? So society would be good. So, but it was basically used as an equality measure, right? How can we make it successful? It wasn't to be able to gain control for the government. is to be able to say, how do two individuals who may not even know each other and their inalienable rights clash, how can we go in to kind of help make sure that everybody gets a fair shake? That
Mm-hmm.
was the intent of, because government on the Declaration of Independence was to secure our inalienable rights. That's their job. The job of the government has only one job. That's to make sure that they secure our inalienable rights with whatever it takes, right? So long story short, the parents par tre doctrine that came from England and the United States, the courts started using that to be able to fight against parental rights because they wanted to favor the children. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So parents par tre doctrine was not used to free a woman from an abusive husband. It was for the government to gain control over the children. Now, it's still used today in our divorce courts, even though when the 14th Amendment happened and the women had the right to vote under women's suffrage movement, the women started gaining more under common law through the courts. They started gaining more equality as far as constitutional rights, right? The women started gaining more constitutional protections from the court. So coverture laws which was also through common law, that said that the woman is a legal extension of her husband, right? So he covered her legally. So that started to dissipate after the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment gave equality to women as far as, at least as the courts looked at it. And then they started changing the common law decisions. They started changing how the courts looked at giving women constitutional rights rather than looking at them as property of the husband. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, and like under property of the husbands, we have such things like the rule of law, right? Or the rule of thumb principles from England, where they would beat the women with a rod that was no bigger than your thumb, and we have a lot of that abuse of women. So so long story short, the 14th Amendment was to give constitutional rights and freedoms to the blacks. I think that they didn't really plan on it, but it started to extend to the women as well. I think that was just a byproduct that the federal government didn't realize that would eventually do. That was used in the court systems. Now, even though today, or actually after the 14th Amendment, when divorce would happen, the courts started saying, well, the children are no longer just property of the husband, right, of the father. Now they were considered really property of both the husband and the wife, right? So they both had constitutional rights to their children. So that's how the courts were originally looking at it in the early 1900s. However, you don't hear that today. If you go through a court system, they won't say that the children are the property of the parents. They'll say that the children are the wards of the state. So what they're saying is, when the courts say the children are the wards of the state, they're saying that the children are property of the state, right? Because under property rights, children don't have the maturity, according to the courts, to be able to make their own decisions. So somebody has to make the decisions for them, right? So unless a child is legally emancipated from the parents, they're not going to have the full individual constitutional rights. So they traditionally had what was called part and parcel of the constitutional rights of the parents. But however, the government said, we're going to use the parents par tre doctrine, and we're going to go in and start protecting or taking children away from parents without proving them guilty in a criminal court of law using beyond a reasonable doubt, or at least clear and convincing evidence. So that's how come today you'll have CPS getting warrants for children, and the child is the one who's taken away in a police car with a social worker, and the mother and father sometimes never even have criminal charges pressed against them at all. And that, again, is because the courts have changed looking at children as property of the parents to children being property of the state.
Yeah, it's just gotten so crazy that I think that parents par tre just made things very crazy.
Right. And when the Supreme Court said, I think it was in 1967 or 68, you'll see it says Henry Galt, people should use this when they go to court. And it basically, it dismantles the parents par tre doctrine, because the Supreme Court justice said that the parents par tre doctrine has no validity historically, right? It's a very dubious, the exact word is dubious that the judge used on his dissent, saying that this is a very dubious doctrine. And this doctrine, the whole intent of this doctrine was was used as a weapon. It was weaponized And the under the juvenile courts in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to be able, because juvenile courts were created in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but it was used there to be able to say, hey, we're going to take away children from parents without having them guilty of a crime, right? And abuse and neglect is a crime. It's still, even today, it's still considered a crime. But majority of parents who are alienated from their children through the court system or having TPR'd, their rights terminated, either through, like I said, you can be alienated from like getting sole custody in a divorce, or you can have your rights terminated in a child protection service or a DSF a case. And there's been no finding of a crime. Now, the courts don't want to bring your abuse and neglect to the criminal courts for the most part, unless they know for sure, because if you're found innocent in a criminal courtroom, right, the family court or juvenile court can't turn around and say you're guilty of the same crime, because they would have to, to hand the kids over to you. So it's easier for the courts, the family court judge and juvenile courts, to not try to go after you in a criminal courtroom for abuse and neglect, but try to handle it in-house and try to supersede your fundamental liberty right. And these are your constitutionally protected rights that strict scrutiny always applies.
Well, it just seems like in some cases, these judges are even ignoring that and they go along with what CPS is saying and lying about and perjuring themselves on the stand. And the judge just willy-nilly listens to them and goes along with it.
Right, because again, there's financial incentives, kids for cash. The government wants control, right? Even though that they might say that they want to have strong families, but in actuality, they would rather have women enter into the workforce for the financial reasons, and they would rather have more control over children because the government always wants power. Now, that's why the founders of America, especially those who designed the Constitution, said that, they didn't really want, when the United States was first founded, the federal government was very weak because the states wanted the supremacy to fall into the states. And that's how it was until the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was designed because we needed a stronger military in case another nation was to attack us, right? So the only way that because if the states had supremacy and there was no centralized federal government, which there really wasn't under the Articles of Confederation, is that we were really weak militarily because states traditionally didn't give a lot of money and didn't give a lot of people for war. So we said, well, if we're going to have a stronger nation to be able to defend ourselves from other nations, we're going to need a larger military force. And also to be able to increase the taxes, right? So what they did was the Constitution was created not to give more rights to the people. The Constitution was created to give more rights to the federal government. Now, the founders, right, you're going to hear the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers, right, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist. There was two rules of thoughts. People says, well, if we give federal government more power, then who's to stop us from being as corrupt as England, right, under Great Britain, under the King of England, who we just freed ourselves from, right? Because they know power corrupts. So they said, well, what we're going to do is the Constitution is going to give the federal government few and enumerated powers, right? And they're going to be very, very clearly laid out. They're very, very few. And they were very afraid of any kind of wishy-washy verbiage like commerce clause, or so there's a commerce clause that you'll hear about that the federal government uses today, but they don't want to stay away from. They wanted very specific in language, and they wanted to make sure that they had more power than the states, but only in very, very limited matters. And that was more to, like I said, more to create a unity of the states collecting of taxes and to have a stronger standing army, which we were eventually able to do because we had to do that as well, because when the Declaration of Independence, we declared independence from Great Britain, we needed a military force to be able to stand against there. So we did need a stronger national security, as you might say. So when the Constitution came in, it did, but what it did was the Anti-Federalists were so afraid that the federal government would start abusing this power, because traditionally it always has. So they created two things. They said, okay, number one, we want supremacy to be to the state and to the people, right? So you'll actually read that in the 8th, 9th, and 10th Amendment. You'll really hear that kind of laid out, that anything not, few and enumerated powers given to the government, anything not specifically given to the federal government, the powers fall between the state and we the people. So it's both. Now, the thought was under the federal government is that all states already had their constitution before the federal constitution. Before the United States Constitution, all the states had constitutional rights. So people had constitutional protections in their individual states. And those constitutions were very similar to the federal government. Matter of fact, the federal government constitution took the principles from the state's constitution, and that's through Thomas Jefferson and other people, and that's how they designed it. But however, checks and balances were also created because the checks and balances was so that one part of government would not become, corrupt and too powerful. Those checks and balances, my presumption is that the Supreme Court was really supposed to be able to play a big role on the balancing of power, because it claimed that you could have juries, right? So jury trials came from I know it's a lot of information, but jury trials came from a human rights document through the Magna Carta in England. And what happened was the King of England was abusing the people and taxing the people. And so they forced the king, as we heard earlier, to actually sign the Magna Carta to make sure that if they were convicted in a courtroom, they wanted it to be by a jury of their peers, not by a corrupt judge that was paid and elected by the king himself. And that actually happened in the United States. United States in the Declaration of Independence, you'll actually see that one of the tyrannical moves of England is that he would appoint and pay judges to actually judge us in the United States. Because under common law, if you control the courtrooms, you control the law, right? That's common law, because they didn't really have that much written or codified law. So it was really based on, England was based on a common law system, United States is based on a common law system. And that's one of the problems with today with packing our Supreme Court justices, right? Because if you control the courts, you can control the law. And so long story short, so the checks and balances have kind of dissipated, right? You don't really have the checks and balances today. When the 14th Amendment came in, it reversed federalism, because what the federal government did was, under the slave amendments, that the states were abusing the black people, right? And they were and the federal government was afraid after the Civil War that they would just continue to do so under their own state supremacy. So what the federal government created the 14th Amendment to be able to say, hey, we want supremacy over the state on matters of inalienable rights, of your life, liberty, and property, or human rights, right? Your natural rights, God-given natural rights. So what that did is reverse federalism, because it brought that promise from the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, over to the federal government. And so life, liberty, and property, right, or life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, is not a few and enumerated right. It's an unenumerated right. So what happened was we had a change of power under the 14th Amendment, and the federal government claimed they needed this so that they had to protect the blacks from the states, violating the human rights of the blacks after they were freed. And so, long story short, as that started prolonging, states lost 100% supremacy. Right? States don't have supremacy anymore at all. It's just a figure of your imagination, because the 14th Amendment reversed federalism. And the reason why this is important, and I know it's a lot of information, or maybe not even where you want to go, but the reason why this is really important is because the 1833 decision of Barron versus Baltimore, the federal government said, well, the Bill of Rights don't apply to the states. And so states were violating people's human rights from 1833 until the 14th Amendment. So when the 14th Amendment came, what they did was called the incorporation doctrine. They started to incorporate the Bill of Rights back into the states, so that the states and the federal government are now responsible for protecting your inalienable rights. But to do this, instead of reversing Barron versus Baltimore, what they did was they changed the entire legal system that it is today. And so now the government, and people don't know this, so under the New Deal legislation around in 1930s, the federal government made basically a deal with the states. And they said, well, we know we have a supremacy to override any state court decision, but they started creating doctrines, like the court started creating doctrines that the federal government wouldn't supersede all these state courts' decisions. And one of the deals is that the federal government promised the states that they would stay out of matters of the family law. That was one of the deals. However, the federal law violated that in over 100 Supreme Court cases so far. So the federal government, as well as the United States Supreme Court, have taken a number of domestic relation courts, family court, juvenile courts, and they federalized them. They granted protections. They gave the homosexuals, right, in 2005 the right to get married. That was federalizing state law. And so the whole premise that the state has supremacy and we the people have supremacy, and the federal government has few and enumerated right, has actually gone away. And that's why we see our federal government really becoming the parent of the nation. They truly are becoming parent of the nation. They're leading states by not telling them what to do, but what the federal government does is it tells the states, hey, we'll only give you money on these federal programs if you do what we say. So the federal government is controlling the states, but is controlling the states by using federal funding as like a carrot on a stick, right? And the states say, well, if we want to compete with one another, we need this federal funding, right? That's the whole thing with like Title IV D&E, right? When it comes to for collections of child support and child support reimbursement acts. But yeah, so this whole thing about this, it's actually kind of amazing. So when the 14th Amendment came and the women started getting more constitutional rights, divorce actually skyrocketed. It increased almost 3 times every single year right after the 14th Amendment. It just skyrocketed immediately. Because what it did is it freed the women from the coverture laws, because under coverture laws, women couldn't own property, right? They couldn't sign contracts or make contracts, and they couldn't initiate divorce. So when they started getting the constitutional rights, they also started getting the right to initiate divorce as well. Does that make sense? So the 14th Amendment gave the women the right to initiate divorce, and not only that, but they were able to get jobs, they were able to get property and homes and take care of themselves. So what it did is it created under the women's suffrage movement or feminism, it created a system where the women didn't need the men anymore, right? Because men have always historically been oppressed. Bless you. Men have always been oppressive towards women, just historically, right? And we see that in Genesis 3:16, right? That one of the punishments of woman is that that you shall desire a husband, but he shall rule over you. So the rule of man has always been a very oppressive element. It wasn't a blessing. The rule of man wasn't a blessing. It was a cursing, right? So if we look at Genesis 3:16, it was a cursing. So what happens is that women, but they always had that desire, the natural desire to be able to produce children and to be able to be provided for, protected for. And historically, men have always played that role. However, today in the industrial age, and the age that we're in today, women don't really need, especially under the 14th Amendment in the United States, for men to be able to get property for them, to sign contracts for them. They can pretty much do everything on their own. And so, because when feminism came into play, so did sexual expression for women. That came into play. They wanted, because under patriarchy, women were conceived under property rights, so they were really considered more chattel, right? And that's where you have the bride prices, right? Because the whole bride prices theory was that women were the property of the father, and then the man would pay bride price or dowry, and that property rights would transfer from the father to the young man. And so they were handled more as chattel. So when the 14th Amendment came in, women were no longer chattel, and so they no longer really had that the male dominance or the Genesis 3:16 curse put upon them, and they really didn't need to have a husband after all. And one of the things of feminism is they wanted to be able to express themselves sexually. It was all about freedom under women's suffrage movement, and sexual expression, freedom of sexual expression was freedom to them. So the sexual revolution, right, the Roaring Twenties and all that stuff, that really came through the women's suffrage movement as they started to be able to enjoy their own freedoms from the oppressive men under coverture laws.
Hmm. Well, it didn't bring this nation far at all. It seems like, now with what's going on, it's like everything's taken a step backwards.
Right, and that's because those parents par tre doctrine was never overturned, even though it came in 1875, and the Supreme Court realized in 1968, I think it was 1967, they realized in Galt that parents par tre doctrine is still dubious. There is something called stare decisis, which is called Latin for let the decision stand. That's where we have the term precedents, right? So what happens was when the Supreme Court has made a number of decisions, it creates a precedence, which creates common law. It creates how the courts usually handle matters, right? So it's common to all. This came from England. So what happened was I was sure I forgot what I was going to go on that one. The parents par tre doctrine is that once that entered into the court system and it became precedence, it's almost impossible to get out. Plus, the government and the courts don't want to let go of the parents par tre doctrine because the courts are not concerned about parents' constitutional rights. They're still part of the government, right? The legislative, judicial, the executive branch. So they still want more power to the state. And so when children become wards of the state through the parents par tre doctrine, the courts actually enjoy that because the judge, a family court judge, enjoys the power to be able to decide how your child will be raised, because everyone is biased in from our background. Everyone's just a biased person. We look through our own lens, and so when judges, they have 100% discretion. They don't have juries over them. They're going to want to choose the parent that most looks like them or be able to raise children most like they would like the children to be raised. So they're not really choosing. Their thoughts is when judges make decision is, hey, who parents more like me, and I trust myself. So and so under my wisdom, I'll go ahead and choose a parent who looks and practices parenting the way that I would parent this child. God bless you.
Oh, thank you.
So it's really just an opinion, right? Discretion is nothing more than another word for an opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the best interest of child standards, right, it doesn't say best interest of child laws, it says standards, because what it was is it wanted to, the best interest of child standards wanted to not force the judges to use a rule of law to be able to decide, very specifically what's good for these children, but it wanted standards because it wanted the flexibility of judges to decide for themselves. Now, in appellate court, you typically will not have a case overturned as long as a judge can somewhat practically apply their decision and many of their decisions to maybe a best interest of the child standards. Before it was overturned if they wouldn't, because the appellate courts would say, well, it's just the opinion of a judge. However, all the judge has to do to be able to have that legal force is to be able to make it any decision that they want, right? And then they can just throw a best interest of the child standard to it, and then pretty much it's unappealable in the courts of law as far as the appellate courts.
Mm-hmm. And they're kind of doing this in a convoluted way with these school districts right now. The school districts want to teach this, that, and the other thing, and these parents are fighting back. And when they do, then they're getting their kids taken away.
Yeah, and that's great because that's the pushback of the government. Hey, well, if you push against the government too hard, they're going to take away your children because they already have authority under the parents par tre doctrine to really take away your child without having you found guilty in a criminal setting, right? In a criminal court of law where you actually have constitutional protections, right? In a criminal court, you still have, even though they're really bad, but you still have constitutional protections in a criminal court of law. You don't have constitutional protections in a family court or juvenile court under preponderance of evidence, because preponderance of evidence is allowed to use hearsay as evidence. Now, to terminate somebody's rights or a parent's rights, right, TPR somebody's rights, they're supposed to use clear and convincing evidence, but it's the same judge, and that judge is just going to listen to hearsay. So they can't switch to clear and convincing to preponderance in their head, right? They're basically just using the same standards that they're using in family court to terminate parental rights.
Mhm.
But that's the government. Now, the government is in charge of the education, right? The education, I believe, originally started as a Catholic or a Christian organization in the United States, and it was very good, right? Matter of fact, many of the universities, I think Yale and a lot of other ones, they were Christian universities. Eventually, the government and the started to gaining control over all schooling systems, the young kids as well as the universities, and now even today, right? These schools that were once are still considered under the Catholic or Christian umbrella have become just totally defiled, right? They become evil instead of good. But what happened is a lot of people don't understand that they use the parents' part doctrine in children wards of the state in your they use that doctrine as the premise for making their laws when your kid goes in school, right? So if you have a kindergartner in school, right, you actually that those children are now really considered wards of the school at that time, right? Wards of the state. And so your parents, right, don't really like, so you can't just, a lot of times if you put your kid in a kindergarten, you can't just walk into the kindergarten and to take your kid out whenever you want, or say, I'm going to go on vacation for a couple of months. The government has, through socialist practices, they've used that parents portray doctrine, and they say that the state is exercising the children's constitutional rights. So if you ever have, like an example, a lot of parents are having court cases against the Board of Education,
Mhm.
and they're losing every single time. And the reason
Mhm.
why is because the parents are saying, well, I'm using my constitutional right and my child's constitutional right. But the way that it happens, that as soon as you drop your child off at school, you lose, realistically, you lose almost 100% of your constitutional rights. And the children are now under the wards or under the care of the Board of Education or the government, the state government. So it's very dangerous to drop your kids off at school, because as soon as you put your kids in a public school, you're handing your children over to the government to raise them. And that has changed from just having, now the Board of Education is entering into the social factor, right? Because
Mhm.
transgenderism and homosexuality has become a protected class and became illegal. So now they're pushing transgenderism and homosexuality and Black Lives Matters and critical race theory. They're pressing these moral principles on these children, and there's nothing that parents can do about it, because under the parents portray doctrine, the nation is the parent of the child. As soon as you drop your child off to a public education, you're handing your child off to the devil, realistically, and you handing your child off to the government, and the government is exercising their supremacy over your children. And matter of fact, like an example, if there's a shooting or a bomb threat in a school, you can't go in and take your children. It's lockdown, and they don't allow parents to be able to take their children. Well, that's a violation of constitutional rights, right? To be
Mhm.
able, because you're inalienable rights, to be able to take your child. If there's a school shooting, you want to take your child as soon as you can out of there. But the governments have under care and control and protection and safety, they can use that whenever they want to be able to override any of your constitutional rights, and that's all based on the parents portray doctrine. And that's where the parent is the nation of the child. As soon as you involve the government or drop your child off to a government facility or organization, or even an administrative organization that's funded through the state and federal government, you're really in danger of, what you're doing is you're handing your children over to the wards of the state, making wards of the state. And there's different levels, but the Board of Education has grown so powerful that parents have not realized that they cannot push against the Board of Education and win. And the court system under parents portray is always going to give preference to the Board of Education or a school, even if it violates your constitutional rights or your child's constitutional rights. Because your child's constitutional rights, as long as he's immature, right, as long as he's a young age, the state exercises the child's constitutional right, not the parent. Traditionally, it was supposed to be the parent exercises the child's constitutional right. But then in matters of law, when it comes to government, the government has been practicing the children's constitutional right, or the court has been practicing the child constitutional right. And that's part of the guardian ad litem, right? That's part of
Mhm.
the government being able to exercise the child's constitutional rights. And we're going to see this play out more and more um, as these labels get more defined as far as children's constitutional rights and who has the power to exercise that. Because as soon as the children become wards of the state, right? As soon as a petition of dissolution is signed by either the man or the woman, those children immediately become wards of the state, and they can even assign temporary orders, even if you're still married. And like I said, but however, constitutionally, these reason it's unconstitutional is because under your children are a unalienable right, a right
Mm.
given by God, a natural right that's protected under the social contract of the Declaration of Independence. But it's also it's the Bill of Rights were nothing more than an extension of the inalienable rights of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. And so your right to be able to raise your child is unalienable. That's how come the Declaration of Independence says, hey, if the government becomes so corrupt, so tyrannical, not only do you have a right, but you have a duty to overthrow such government and to replace you new leaders to secure your inalienable rights.
Mhm.
Your children, you need to know what's an inalienable right. An inalienable right means a non-transferable right. That was from the 3rd century BCE. That was a real estate term where a property could not be transferred. So it's non-transferable. You couldn't transfer that property, you couldn't sell it, couldn't get rid of it. Same thing with inalienable rights, right? Anything that God gives you is considered a natural God-given right. Now, we know what's an inalienable right because the Declaration of Independence mentions God 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. In your preamble, saying that your inalienable rights were given by God. They're called God's, I believe it says God's nature, nature's God. So it does recognize that anything that God gives you, the state cannot take away from you. So the children, your state did not give you children, right? You birthed the children. They came from God. They're given to you. They're given to you alone. So realize the Declaration of Independence was signed, and we fought against Great Britain because of these human right violations against our families, us and our families, to protect our families, right?
Mm.
And so the same thing for today. You have a right. You parents, you do not have rights. The court doesn't give you rights to your children. You have those rights inherited by God, and the state can't take away those children unless it's for a temporary period of time. But that's only if you've been found guilty for breaking a law and thrown into jail, where you have your liberty taken away. But you must have the protections of the criminal court to be able to have the jury, to be able to have the evidence of beyond a reasonable doubt evidence, and not these preponderance of evidence, not even clear and convincing evidence, but definitely not preponderance of evidence of hearsay in the family courts.
That is so much awesome information that, I hope parents listen to this.
Yeah, but I think parents are starting to realize how little control they have over their children now, as the Board of Education has switched to a moral responsibility of diversity, right? For Black and whites and children of different colors, as they're trying to push homosexuality, as they're trying to have transgender story time, come in, or they did for a little bit of period of time. They're having books that are pushed in the Board of Education that are pushing homosexual agendas. All this is because people don't realize this, but Christianity has slowly become, or vastly become, a hate crime in the United States, because whenever you press against a law, it's considered a hate crime. Now, homosexuality is, since 2005, under a federal program, through the United States Supreme Court, has now federalized it. So if you say anything against homosexuality, right, that's considered a hate crime. Transgenderism, say anything against transgenderism, that can be a social or even be considered a hate crime. So you have the LGBTQI plus right now really being able to use through the power of the government, because the government is supporting them by making those practices legal, and they're pressing and they're teaching that to your children. And right now parents are starting to realize that if I can't opt out of programs in the school, even as a kindergartner. If you say to your teacher, I don't want my kid to be able to be, forced these moral principles, because morality should be taught at home, right? Education of sciences and math and education can be taught in the public schools, right? But once you start having morality and ethics taught in a school, forced on your children, that's different than your own, that's going to be a constitutional violation. However, realize, guys, that the Board of Education is an extension of the government. So you cannot expect to hand your children over to the government and then still protect your child from constitutional and moral violations. You have to get your children out of the public school systems. The public school systems, by handing the children over to public school systems, they're still a government organization, and you're really not going to be able to change them too much. You'll be able to have some of your rights, but when parents start taking children out of the public education, the public education will at that time, because of taxes, they get money for a certain number of students they have. They'll start changing their tune. But as long as you still you put your child in the schools, and you go to these council meetings, they're not going to listen to you. They have dead looks on their faces. They're not listening to you at all. So they don't care about your thoughts at all. Don't think that these council meetings that you go to, PTA meetings, that they're listening to you. They're not listening to you at all. They don't care. But when you start taking your children out of there, and that tax money for the schools starts to decrease, then you're going to start getting their attention.
Would it be better to put them into a private school?
Yeah. So private school, you're going to have a lot more control. Now, it's still considered, right, you got the 501c3, you still got federally funded. Whenever you have something that's funded through the federal government, tax exemption, property exemption, or anything to do with state or federal funding, right, there's still going to be, the government's still going to have their hand of control. That's one of the problems with the churches today, right? The churches have a large debt. They're in a large debt, and then also they have the 501c3. And so what it does is they still, churches even today, they lose a little bit of that. You're trading your supremacy for socialism, in a sense, right? To be able to, hey, government, help me out financially, like welfare programs and so forth. You're always giving away a little bit of your rights to be able to have the government to protect you and to provide for you. But yeah, so it's even a private school that's federally and state funded, or receives state and federal funds, or has a 501c3 or property tax, they're still going to have a lot of government involvement with the education factors. If you really want to be free of that stuff, you really have to start homeschooling. But that means that the families need to stay together. And that means the woman needs to stay at home to be able to raise the children and to teach the children. And then that's going back to a patriarchal style marriage that you'll see in the Bible, right, in the New Testament, the Old Testament. But when, like I said, the 14th Amendment freed the women from the coverture laws, which in turn is women wanted to free themselves from the abuse of male power, because men have a tendency to abuse power. People who have power have a tendency to abuse it, even in families. So women had 100% right to say, I want to be able to free myself from my husband if he's oppressive to me, if he is verbally abusive, right? However, the Bible says differently. The Bible says that the woman was not supposed to be able to initiate divorce. She never had that right to initiate divorce under the law of Moses. Only the men could. And that because one of the things is that, if children, put it this way, if children had the freedom to be able to leave a family whenever they felt oppressed, and they were able to be taken care of by the government, we'd have a lot more children leaving families as well. It's just a natural byproduct of us being able to trying to flee the suppressive movement. However, authority was set in scripture, and the women were designed to be followers, and men were designed to be leaders. But the only way to save your child really is to be an intact family. Matter of fact, Marianne, if you're going through juvenile court and you're trying to have your rights terminated through Child Protection Services, Human Services, or DCF, if they hate mothers and fathers working together, because both the mother and the father, they can go after one parent, but they have it's very, very tough for them to go after two parents, because when they go after two parents, they have to say, well, two parents, they are abusive, they are druggies. It's very hard for them to do that. So as long as families are intact, the government really can't go in and swoop your children under Child Protection Services as well.
Well, you also wrote an excellent book on the religious. It's mostly for priests, pastors, rabbis. Tell us about that book that you wrote.
Yeah. So what I did was, when I was going through Bible college, my mom was married and divorced twice before. And, so we were raised, and my mom was raising 4 kids by herself, 2 from one husband, 2 from another. And when I went through after Marine Corps, I went into the Bible college. I think just because of my familiarity with divorce, I really picked up that divorce remarriage topic. Now, I wasn't dating anybody. I was a young guy, like 21, just out of Marine Corps, and so I got out of the Gulf War, and so I picked up that man, and I was like, wow, divorce remarriage was supposed to be really easily understood, but it seems that the Christians are just as confused about it as the Jews were in the Old Testament, right?
Mhm.
Why do we have still the same unclarity? Because Jesus made it so simple with very few words, right? Very few scriptures. He spoke about the issues of marriage, divorce, or remarriage. Why are we still arguing about it 2,000 years later? Because
Mhm.
in the gospel accounts and in the First Corinthians, it seemed like it was pretty much an accepted, premise. Now, historically, as the Catholicism it really took over power at the centralized church, and then it became part with the state, right? We heard about that in 300 AD, I think it was, and then the power of the power of the Catholic Church is that they started implementing these, changing the divorce laws, right, based on biblical premise. And this is based on canon scripture through pretty much a lot of history, most of history. And this was under the Roman occupation,
Mhm.
as one of the Caesars. I forgot who it was, but he actually became a Christian, and then he implemented those Christian values and changed it from the Greco-Roman practices of divorce or marriage, was where everybody was getting divorced and remarrying, and they had child marriages, and I mean, like homosexual child marriages. It was really sick. Is that
Mhm.
when at 300 AD, 386 or something AD, when that one, I can't remember who it was, but he actually said, he became a Christian, implemented the Christian principles into their state laws. They stopped giving divorce. Matter of fact, they would only allow somebody to annul divorce. So divorce was still permitted for the man. The woman wasn't allowed to divorce usually during these times, from 300 AD on up until 1800s in England for the most part. The women were not able to divorce based on biblical principles. So my book actually talks about why women were not allowed to divorce under the law of Moses, and how we use that today in today's feminist or egalitarian culture. How do we use the laws today under a different social factor? And I present the case that women really shouldn't have that right to divorce, because it was never granted to them according to scripture, both in the Old Testament and the New. And it just creates a problem, which we saw in 1875 in the women's suffrage movement. And this is right now what we're living in today, is a byproduct of really giving men and women equal rights. Now, men and women have equal value, and they just have different roles. But as far as the legal system was concerned, in the scriptures, this is according to Numbers 30. Numbers 30, it said that a woman remained or a young girl remained under the authority of her father in her youth, as long as he was under his roof. But when she got a husband, that the authority would transfer to the man, so the woman never left the home. But it does say in Numbers 38:9, it says, however, the widow and the divorced woman, right, she doesn't fall under the supremacy of a man, right? She doesn't fall under the authority of a man. So a divorced woman or a widow, they had a lot more freedom. But there was nothing in the Bible that talked about girls who were 18 years old who moved out on their own, and were able to practice their own freedoms, and no longer under the roof of the father. So
Mhm.
the roof of the father was always based on biblical principles, the bride price, and be able to keep the sexual purity of the children. But long story short, so my book just kind of talks about that, and it helps people to look in a different light as far as third world countries, and the Bible, and how we should look at it today. But today, like I said, right now, if people say, well, where's your proof text? You just look at socially today, where we're at today, and just see what divorce has done, right? Divorce has allowed the government to come in and to take our children, to take our money, and to pit the man and woman against one another, right?
Mhm.
And the government is the one who is gaining power from that, and they're gaining our children. We have 500,000 children in the foster care system in the United States today,
Mhm.
and these are all based on premises. As soon as we started letting the government in, as soon as we started having divorce, we really lose that family structure and that family protection. the house, or the king's no longer, it was the king of the castle, right? It was always traditionally looked at is that when you had your house, you were your king of that house,
Mhm.
and your wife and your children were inalienable rights.
Mhm.
And the government couldn't come in. Nobody could, domestic or foreign, could come
Mhm.
in and take your child or take anything from you as long as you were in your house, right? You had your gun, you're protected, your inalienable rights.
Mhm.
However, today, the government will walk right in, even without a warrant, and the police will strong arm you into and trick you into either signing, giving your children, giving the courts rights over the children, and say, we allowed you to keep your children as long as you signed this paper, but it's really just saying, hey, I'm releasing my authority of my children to the state. Or they say, we're going to take away your children right now, and
Mhm.
under duress, and
Mhm.
under illegal and unconstitutional principles, the government is taking children away from families.
Mhm. Most definitely. Your book is called The Cure for Divorce in the Kingdom of God, and it can be found on Amazon.
Yeah, I actually changed the title a little bit. I might
Oh,
go back
that's
with that.
right. That's
Yeah,
right.
no, it's okay, because like I was trying to see what kind of works, because when people saw The Cure for Divorce, a lot of people didn't use this as a doctrinal, like, for divorce, marriage, divorce, or remarriage. They were just saying, oh, well, the cure is just, hey, love each other and be kind for each other. Well, that's not what it's a historical look of 3,000 years of divorce. So I
Mhm.
changed the title to remarriage and adultery in the Bible. But however, I'm still playing with the title. But if you can find it right now under remarriage and adultery, I'll probably keep it under that. And you can see it under Kindle. You can get it for free, or 99 cents. There's a choice in there. Or you can always email me, and I can email you a free copy of PDF it to you.
Mhm.
You can just email me. I'm sure you'll probably give my email address in the bottom of this video, and they can just get in touch
Yes.
with me. I could just email it to them. So
Oh, yeah, I'll put that in the podcast notes, and I totally thank you for coming on the show and
thank you.
explaining all of this. This was great. This was a great historical lesson and what's going on right now, which is very scary.
That's right. And another Halloween scary
Yes,
production, right? Another
right.
scary Halloween production.
Exactly. It really is. It
It
really.
really is. It really is.
Hey, don't jump off. Slam the Gavel's a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in these family courtrooms. I'm your host, Marianne Petrie, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. Please join us again here with Michael. I will have him back on, and other exciting guests. And I thank you again, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks. Awesome.